I call this house to order. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this, the semi-final round of the 2010 McGill Winter Carnival Tournament. Seated on my left, representing the government, are the team from Hartard A, with its Prime Minister, Richard Lizius, and its Minister of the Crown, Mark Samburg. Seated on my right, representing Her Majesty's loyal opposition, are the team from Dalhousie with its two speakers, Auyon Siddiq and Cherri. Without any further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister to rise and speak to the motion that stands in his name. Hear, hear.
Thank you ever so kindly, Mr. Speaker. In the status quo, there are a set of sanctions the United States has put in place against Iran. These are both against American companies investing in Iran and against foreign companies investing in Iran. So the United States also punishes a foreign company that invests in the Iranian oil fields or any other practice. We say you should remove all of these sanctions. The United States should remove all sanctions on Iran. Obviously, we're also not cool with increasing them at the same time. Okay, I'm going to talk about why this is a good idea. I'm going to begin by talking about why sanctions are ineffective, both for stopping nuclear proliferation and regime change. I'm going to talk about the positive consequences this would have domestically in Iran, the positive international consequences, and maybe why we'd like to cooperate with Iran. Samburg might deal with that. So let's talk about why they're ineffective. First of all, why sanctions don't prevent nuclear proliferation. You recognise that Iran already has all the material it needs to actually produce a nuclear weapon. It has the uranium. It also doesn't have all the knowledge necessary to weaponize that uranium and turn it into a bomb. However, they are rapidly developing that technology. They have all the intellectual capacity and material they need. It's only a matter of time before Iran gets to that point. At best, all sanctions can do is prevent any escalation in that process. In other words, it might accelerate if they got additional information, but frankly, they have enough to get there eventually anyway, so I don't think sanctions are going to be an effective means of actually stopping the development of nuclear weapons, which is one of their goals. The other and perhaps more important goal for these sanctions has been the idea that we want the Iranian regime to stop being dicks, basically. We'd like the end to the Islamic Republic. We'd like to see democratization and regime change. And it's totally ineffective at bringing about that end. The first reason is that the sanctions are quite incomplete. Insofar as Russia, China, India, other developing markets can continue to trade with Iran in a meaningful sense. It's also unlikely that we're ever going to get these countries on board with an increased sanctions regime, precisely because Chinese and Russian demand for oil is sufficiently great that they're willing to risk the ire of the United States in order to actually get access to these markets that are incredibly valuable to them. They also see Iran as an incredibly important strategic partner. So it's unlikely you're going to get these countries on board. Without access to them, the regime continues to survive just a little bit poorer than it would otherwise be. Nevertheless, it materially would have access to everything it needs. Secondly, even if these sanctions were total, even if you could get Russia and China on board, which is unlikely, we still think it's unlikely to change the regime. First of all, it means that the regime can blame any hardship it wants on the United States. Because it can say, we're suffering because the Americans are stopping us from engaging in the global economy. This is exactly what Saddam Hussein did in Iraq, and exactly one of the core bases for the nationalism that he was able to stoke up. Furthermore, particularly considering the history of interference by the United States and the West in Iranian internal affairs, there is a great deal of animosity towards the West that is easily built upon using these things like conspiracy theories. Finally, we recognise that Iran would have a great deal, I'll get you in a second, a great deal of ability to retaliate through things like destabilising Iraq, through things like mining depletion.
But haven't Iranians shown the capacity to look past Western hatred by saying, instead of death to America, death to Ayatollah, death to the president of Ahmadinejad, they can't see past that and they can try to pass out.
So I don't know if you've been listening to any press releases by the Iranian regime, but they've not been all flowers and reconciliation, particularly under Ahmadinejad. They've been incredibly combative. And the reason he does that is that that makes good political sense. Attacking the United States, playing on your own status as a victim of imperialism, as the victim of a crusade, is an extremely effective domestic tactic. When you remove his ability to do that to the same degree, I think you're far more likely to see moderates actually get in a reasonable position. So let's talk about these domestic consequences. Because recognize that when moderates, people like Musali, people like Rafsanjani say, we need to engage with America more, we need to normalize relations with the world, the best response that they give, that you can see to them, is the extremists saying, no, America is punishing us, America is excluding us, America is playing this negative role. Recognize that in the mass disturbances following the faked election last year, what the government kept saying is that these people are funded by the Americans, they're in the pocket of the Americans. So anti-Americanism is one of the key planks that keeps the current regime in place. By dealing with that, we think you really help out. Secondly, through increased trade, I think you're going to develop the middle class to a meaningful sense, right? Increased trade does lead to greater wealth, lead to greater prosperity, greater access to education. The best way to defeat religious fundamentalism is to ensure that people have access to education, because then they have access to these different worldviews. The intellectual monopoly of the regime is largely broken. We think that's a great way to do that. Furthermore, it weakens the desire for weaponization, insofar as if America is no longer taking such a combative stance towards you, the fear that you need to protect yourself from America is massively reduced. Seeing as we don't have the material capacity to stop them getting nukes, we think the best way to actually stop them is to be friends, to say, let's trade, don't worry, you don't need the weapons. It's not guaranteed to succeed, but I think it is far more likely than an ineffective combative stance. Finally, I want to talk about the international consequences, because I think this substantially weakens Iranian influence in the region. One of the best ways Iran exerts influence is through its popularity with basically the lower classes in many of the states throughout the Middle East. And they play upon that role as the enemy of America to do this. They say, your governments are corrupt and deal with the Americans, whereas we are victims of American imperialism and stand up to America. When you reduce the degree to which America is taking a combative stance towards Israel, towards Iran, their ability to use this status of victimization to make themselves more popular is substantially decreased. I think reducing their ability to influence the population of states like Saudi Arabia or Egypt is wonderful. Far more importantly, in the status quo, we continue with sanctions, Iran remains in the pocket of Russia and China. Russia and China are the people today who provide them with economic assistance, provide them with weapons, provide them with everything they need to survive. Consequently, China gets a potentially nuclear-armed proxy state in the Middle East, and that is totally unacceptable. By breaking that dependence, we may not make Iran like us, but at least we can mean that Iran isn't totally dependent on China, and that in and of itself is a win, even if we don't become good friends. There's also a lot of scope for cooperation on things like fighting with Taliban and Sunni extremists because they're Shia and they don't like each other either. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
I thank the Prime Minister for his speech, and I call upon the member of the opposition to deliver his 7-minute speech. Hear, hear.
All right, thanks, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about two constructive points before I address Richard's PMC. The first thing I want to talk about is why sanctions are absolutely necessary when we're talking about corporations, right? Because we think this is very distinct from putting sanctions simply on the government at large. We heard in the PMC that we're talking about not allowing corporations to operate in Iran, right? The only meaningful way we can ever put any sort of bounds on a corporation is to apply these sort of sanctions, right? There's no ability to politically negotiate with them. There's no other avenue, right? The only way we can meaningfully restrict the operation of corporations in a given country is to put these sort of sanctions. And we think this unique dilemma means that the American government must absolutely do this because it's the only tool they have available to them to prevent economic prosperity with these corporations in Iran, right? So we think we need to hear some sort of alternative as to how the American government can actually deal with these corporations that are existing within Iran. We don't think there's any meaningful alternative. We think sanctions are absolutely necessary in that sort of situation. The second thing I want to talk about is this question of Israel, right? Which Richard kind of inadvertently flagged, so I think I'll talk about it. Okay, we think the United States government has a moral imperative to do absolutely whatever it can to Israel based on the idea that Iran's entire philosophy right now is the destruction of Israel, right? We hear this very cultural personality leader repeatedly saying time and time again that he will do whatever he can to destroy Israel. Mr. Speaker, even if sanctions do not completely eliminate the nuclear threat of Iran, I think we heard conceded on Richard's PMC that it may in fact delay it, right? And I think that alone is enough justification for the United States to place these sanctions on Iran. Because we don't think it's appropriate for the United States to simply sit back and say, look, this isn't going to be effective enough, therefore we're not going to pursue it at all as a means of disarming that nuclear state, Mr. Speaker. We think that when you have a tool such as sanctions, when you have a tool such as economically destabilizing the state such that it makes them harder to progress technologically, you should pursue that means. We don't think it's appropriate, or we don't think it's enough for the government to simply stand up and say it's not going to get rid of the problem completely, so we shouldn't pursue it at all. We think you should have to do whatever you can to slow down the progress of nuclear technology in Iran. And if that means destabilizing the economy through these sanctions, we think that is appropriate. We think there's a moral imperative to do that. I'll take you, Mark.
Presumably, if Richard and I can bring in a more moderate regime, the risk of Iran going nuclear is less on like 5 or 6 different fronts, no?
Right, like I'll talk about this whole moderacy thing in a bit. So those are the 2 constructive points that I want to stand by today. I think the government really has to show that sanctions don't have any impact on the progress of nuclear arms in Iran. Because on our side of the house, we are perfectly okay if you slow down progress, because that buys you time, Mr. Speaker, that allows you to deal with them. It buys you time on the political and diplomatic front. I'll take it, Richard.
Oh yeah, so that's not our burden at all. Surely we have to prove that an Iran that without these sanctions is less likely to be a threat. That also is impacted by their willingness to attack, as well as their material ability.
Okay, yeah, and like that again speaks back to like what is the political and like religious culture of Iran, and can we actually change it by getting rid of these sanctions? We're going to say no, because the extremist Islamics in Iran fester on this idea of anti-Americanism. We don't think sanctions alone is what's fueling anti-Americanism in Iran, right? And I'll talk about this more in my rebuttal speech, which I'll start now. We talked about regimes change and like how it's ineffective. I talked about this ineffectiveness. Yes, maybe it doesn't absolutely destabilize Iran enough that they can't acquire nuclear weapons, but we think that if you can buy time, which is an extremely valuable commodity when we're talking about diplomatic relations, you should be able to do that. He also said like regime change is gold. Okay, we still think like the US is the largest market, and so like Iran has other markets that you can go to, but we think that in the status quo, the United States still has sort of the potential and the financial strength to serve as that kind of deterrent. Let's talk about these positive consequences. Okay, this issue of like moderacy in Iran, right? Because I think what we heard on Thai government is this idea that economic sanctions against Iran are fueling extremism and giving more fire to the extremist clerics in Iran. That might be true to a degree, right? But I think financial sort of sanctions are only one of the many tools that extremist clerics use in Iran to create hate against the West. We hear the United States even conceding that these people hate our way of life. They hate the ideals that are propagated by the West. If this is in fact true, Mr. Speaker, economic sanctions are only a fraction of the reason why extremists have power in Iran. They have to tell us why getting rid of sanctions will somehow make everyone jolly with the United States again, make everyone less likely to prop up these extremist clerics, right? We don't think this is true. We think that the US's general aggressiveness towards the Middle East at large is what causes this extremism to flourish. The war in Afghanistan is what fuels extremism in Iran. The war in Iraq is what fuels extremism in Iran. Their overt support for the state of Israel, which we're going to say is great, is what fuels extremist Islam in Iran. This simple idea of putting economic sanctions isn't going to, the simple idea of removing these sanctions isn't going to completely disarm the extremists, as Thai government have you believe. We think that moderacy is not going to happen with simply removing this. We think that long-term and sort of large-scale change in that region is what's necessary. So we don't think that like the loss you give up by getting rid of these sanctions is justified, because you're not really going to gain that moderacy in Iran by any means. These people are crazy. Okay, let's talk about the international consequences, right? And so like, what you can do is you can sort of destabilize or at least disarm this relationship between Russia and China and Iran based on these economic sanctions. And like Richard told us, like, look, this might not completely detach them from Russia and China, but at least like it's more likely that Iran's relationship with them won't be as strong because you won't create the dependency, right? We don't think this is true. We think that like regardless of what happens, Iran is always going to see Russia and China as a friendlier state towards them, the United States, right? So even if the United States removes all economic sanctions, this doesn't mean that Iran is suddenly going to be like, well, now we don't need Russia and China to back us as much because the US is friendly with us again, right? We don't think this trust exists. We think that even if the United States removes sanctions from Iran, you're not going to suddenly create this element of trust where Iran doesn't feel like it needs Russia and China as much anymore. We think there will always be that dependency because of the hatred towards the United States, because of this this complex where they feel as though the United States is propping up Israel, which is right next door, which is a threat to Iran, or at least a perceived threat to Iran, or something they don't like very much, right? So we don't think there will be any changes on the international scene because the link between Russia, China, and Iran will fester regardless of whether or not these sanctions exist. We think that the ideological differences between Iran and the United States are so vast that the sanctions, or the elimination of the sanctions, isn't going to be enough to change the scenario. What did we talk about, Mr. Speaker? We talked about why sanctions and the only tool you can actually use to destabilize corporations within Iran, and why we think there's a moral imperative to do absolutely everything you can to actually slow down progress of a nuclear state that is like seeking to destroy Israel. Also, we talked about this regime change concept and how we don't think moderacy is actually going to be accomplished with these sanctions. It's not enough to give up these sanctions simply because you think there is a chance that they will become friendly with the United States. For those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we beg to oppose.
I thank the member of the opposition for his speech. I call upon the Minister of the Crown to deliver a 7-minute speech. Here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to begin with an overarching observation about the opposition that we received today. I then want to move to the new point of analysis that Richard told you again. Then I'll rebut what we heard from the MO. Then I'll go back to Richard, all in 7 minutes. It's going to be amazing. The observation that I want to make about the opposition that we got from side opposite today is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Richard and I told you point blank at the very beginning of PMC that sanctions cannot stop nuclear development in Iran. Ultimately, that was conceded by side opposition, and they rested their hat entirely on the idea that we will be able to delay nuclear development in Iran. They didn't give us any other meaningful benefits to sanctions. So what Richard and I believe is that we can show you that delaying nuclear development in Iran in a sanction-laden state is of utterly no value whatsoever, leaving opposition with no offense. Just want to flag that. We'll move down as we go. The new material that I want to bring is, as Richard described, the ideas of cooperative opportunities with Iran. We see three that are particularly important. One, we believe that Iran shares our interest in dealing with the Taliban. Two, we believe that Iran shares our interest in opposing Wahhabi extremists due to a Shia-Sunni divide. And three, and perhaps most importantly, we believe that Iran shares our interest if they are ever able to develop nuclear weapons, which both sides of the House believe they will. We believe that having at least some level of relations with Iran is incredibly critical. Richard and I believe that having a hotline between two nuclear capitals, the proverbial red phone, is absolutely essential for safety in a nuclear society. We believe that nuclear incidents do occur, that nuclear accidents do occur, and clear lines of communications between leaders of nuclear powers are essential to prevent inappropriate responses that can lead to massive catastrophes. That said, let's look at what we got from the member opposite. The first thing that he told you is that the only way that we can possibly control corporations within Iran is through sanctions. First of all, Mr. Speaker, Richard and I would just observe that this is empirically false. You can control your own corporation's behavior in foreign countries through regulations that don't amount to sanctions. But more importantly than that, Richard and I aren't entirely clear why we would want to be limiting our corporate activity in Iran. In fact, a large portion of our case was that we want corporate activity in Iran because we believe that seeing prosperity in that country will serve essential goals in many, many key ways. So if they are correct that Richard and I can't control the behavior of foreign corporations in Iran, and that means there will be a lot of foreign investment in Iran and a lot of economic development in Iran, then that's wonderful, and we are even more proud to stand on proposition. The second thing that we got from the member opposite was this idea of basically two things, Israel and nuclear development. So let's talk about Israel briefly. Essentially we hear Ahmadinejad wants to drive the Jews into the sea. Yes, Ahmadinejad does want to drive the Jews into the sea. But remember what Richard and I have told you about the likelihood of moderation. I'll get to why those points still stand in a little bit. But recognize that if we successfully replace Ahmadinejad, if we successfully have some sort of regime change, it's likely that the new leadership in Iran will not exactly be pro-Zionist, but it's also likely that they will no longer be the complete effing lunatics that Ahmadinejad is, not somebody who wants to see Israel wiped off the map entirely. But more importantly, here's the essential element. Their concern in this point was the development of nuclear weapons, of Iran becoming a nuclear state while also hating Israel. I've dealt with the hating Israel point. Let's look at the development of nuclear weapons. Both sides of the House in the debate today concede that Iran will become a nuclear state at some point. And what we've heard from side opposition is that there's a benefit to biding ourselves the time before that happens. Mr. Speaker, as it currently stands, it doesn't make a difference whether Iran has the weapons tomorrow or 10 years from now. They talk about diplomacy, they talk about exchange of ideas, they talk about political mechanisms. Those are failing. Those connections do not exist. We do not have the opportunity to use this time to do anything meaningful. We have to lift these sanctions so that we have the diplomatic relations, so we have the ability to try to insert meaningful political change before the weapons arrive. So we can put it off for a long time and be ineffective for a long time, or we can shorten our window of opportunity to make a change, but actually give ourselves the ability to make that change. Richard and I would stand on that. Sure.
Under your model, any nation that wants to develop nuclear technology, instead of trying to stop them in any way, we would simply say, we'll help you, we'll be on board. When that happens, we're going to be your friend.
Under our model, nothing. Look, we screwed up with Iran. They got to the point where the nuclear technology is inevitable. Of course we have an obligation to try to prevent rogue states from going nuclear. We failed in this instance. Iran is going to go nuclear. Your partner said it himself in his speech. Richard said it in his, and now I'm saying it now. The question is, do we want them to go nuclear while they're still angry, while we still can't talk to them, while the hotline still doesn't exist, or do we want them to go nuclear when we have the ability to exert some sort of diplomatic influence? Yes, we'll have less time to do it, but at least we'll be able to do something. Let's look at what Richard told you. The first thing he said is that these sanctions are wholly ineffective and wholly meaningless. Again, we hear from opposition, look, come on, we can buy time. Again, that time is useless. I think we've explained this adequately. Then Richard says very interestingly that because of the sanctions that we have in place, Iran has simply been forced to find other markets to trade with, other markets to deal with, specifically Russia and China. The response we get is that the United States is an enormous market. True, I'm sorry, we are way more awesome than you guys. We are an enormous market, and therefore, he says, we can exert influence over Iran. So the challenge is, you can be the biggest market in the world. If you don't have any inroads into the country and you have no connections to the country, it doesn't matter what the hell you do, right? The United States does all sorts of things all the time that affect you guys. Haha, softwood timber. On the other hand, we do all sorts of things that should affect Iran if we had ties with Iran, and Iran says, meh, tough shit, what's up Moscow, what's up Beijing, what's going on over there? The point is, it doesn't matter how large you are unless you have those connections. We need to establish those influences. Then Richard and I talked to you about the fact of domestic anti-Western propaganda in Iran. The major response that we get is clerics will still successfully be anti-Western, will still successfully imbue anti-Western sentiment in their followers. Richard and I have two crucial responses. First of all, they're probably right that we can't solve for Islamic extremism by lifting sanctions on Iran. Sorry guys. What we can probably solve for is Iranian nationalism containing such a critical element as pro-Western sentiment. Right, we can't deal with the clerics. What we can do is we can moderate the politicians. We can ensure that we don't actually see that among the people outside of their mosques. But more importantly, Richard and I believe that anti-Western sentiment on the ground will be reduced when people see Western goods in their stores, when people have positive impressions of the West from their daily interactions. And even if that now conflicts with what they hear from their clerics, even if that now conflicts from what they hear with their leadership, they will have empirical evidence to weigh against it. We believe that's important. Finally, we talk to you about the regional importance. We tell you something critical that just doesn't get a response. We can reduce Iranian influence in the region, because once we have some sort of positive ties with the country, they lose their ability to say, we are the anti-Western pillar. We are the voice of the Islamic Middle East. We are the people who are concerned about you, the Arabs on the ground. Finally, we hear from opposition, they'll always be closer to Russia and China. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. But Richard and I believe that when you remove their dependency, when you remove their sole relationships, you allow the Americans to have a voice at the table. We stand in proposition.
I thank the Minister of the Crown for his speech. I call upon the Leader of the Opposition to deliver his 10-minute speech. Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be here. What I want to talk about today is essentially how even if these sanctions are ineffective in a tangible, physical way, we would say we still have something on our side, which is the political significance of these sanctions. Because recognize, ladies and gentlemen, when you remove these sanctions from Iran, what the hell do you do to the protesters protesting the abuses of the Iranian government? You're saying the American government is going to go weak, it's going to go lax on the Iranian government, that is essentially supportive of the Iranian government's actions. Moreover, what do you do to your allies, ladies and gentlemen? What do you do with the EU, which has up to now been putting to shame Obama's strategy with Iran, because Obama's been all too much carrot and not enough stick. We think that essentially what we need to do is we need to collaborate with our allies who are trying to take a hard stance in actually affecting regime change. We don't think diplomacy is going to work, because even if you try to create better relations with Iran, Iranian government, it's not going to be like, hey, we're friends now. It's going to be Ahmadinejad saying, hey, we won. We beat those bastards. We can actually stick it out and rough it out. This is why the terror strategy simply doesn't work. This is why, especially at this time in particular, where regime change and where the Iranian political scene is quite volatile, it's dangerous to make that political statement that we're going to go even softer on the Iranian regime. We say maintain the corporate sanctions, even if they don't stop corporations from doing anything, which we think they do.
So we didn't say that you had to say we liked the regime or that we were okay with human rights abuses. You can continue to play a role as a critic. We just think trade is the best way to actually get those abuses.
Okay, so say you don't like the Iranian human rights abuses, but let's take softer actions on them. We think just the very action in of itself, ladies and gentlemen, says you like the Iranian regime, or not you like them, but you're okay with it. That's okay, what's happening to Iranian people, that they're being run over by police trucks, and that they're being abused and imprisoned. We don't think that's okay. Moving on to some refutation, what did Adam talk about? He essentially talks about how there's essentially no value in delaying this cooperation with the Iranian government. That they have interests in the region, they have interests that they can share with us. But we don't think we can actually collaborate with a government that sponsors terrorism in Lebanon. We don't think we can collaborate with a regime which is intent on breaking just about every international norm there is. The international norm of not sponsoring terrorism, the international norm of not developing nuclear weapons technologies. So we think, and specifically with Iran, we cannot sponsor a government, or we cannot cooperate with a government which is intent on destroying someone. They're sponsoring a terrorist group, ladies and gentlemen, which launches attacks against Israel. We don't think that's something that we can actually take a cooperative role with or collaborate. They need to make some concessions, but on our side, on their side of the house, they don't need to make any concessions whatsoever if we give them this benefit. And we don't think that's really fair. We don't think that puts America in a great situation. Moving on to this idea, I want to talk about one more thing before we go into some reputation rebuilding, which is they don't really talk about the end game. They're essentially saying that the developing of nuclear weapons is going to happen anyway, therefore we should collaborate with them. But what about the end game, ladies and gentlemen, when they actually have the nuclear weapons? We think that in of itself is unacceptable. We don't think America should necessarily say, oh, you have nuclear weapons now, so you're in the club. Right? We think we should continue to maintain pressure on Iran, because if they win, if they actually maintain nuclear weapons, all of a sudden America says, we're going to cooperate with you because you've got the power. There's nothing to say that other regimes will say that this is a risky, this is a most beneficial risk to take, right? If we do this, if we get into the stage of development, then the US will put us into the club of acceptance. We think they don't really show us how we can't stop people from developing nuclear weapons. The best way to show is showing that the international community can condemn them, right? But if the U.S. falls back, that condemnation, the incentive for Russia and China to cooperate on this matter falls down. The EU is putting on a pretty hard stance. America should join them and get Russia and China in, because they also have an incentive. Like, for example, with North Korea, they don't want to develop nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation is not in the interest of anyone. Iran's a specific instance, but it's going to develop precedent, and we think it's a dangerous one.
Don't you think that there's a bigger problem with actively condemning and being mean to a new nuclear power when a guy has an itchy trigger finger and a red button?
Is there something mean about that? We think it's pretty mean for them to develop nuclear weapons, when everyone essentially said we're not going to develop. So let's go into some refutation, some rebuilding first. Because Auyon, first of all, talked about corporate responsibility, right? And Adam essentially said, well, we want this corporate money, we want our corporations in there. There are really two reasons why we don't want corporations in there. First of all, we don't think it's responsible. We just simply don't think it's moral. We think the moral argument here stands, and they really haven't addressed that whatsoever. But secondly, we think it makes it that much harder to act against the government when there's involvement of corporate money. When you have corporations investing in a country and they want that country to succeed, they don't want sanctions on that country, it makes it that much harder, that much more inertia for the entire international community to act against that country. But if you stop corporations from investing in Iran, which we think this does, because it bans them from a huge market in the US, we think that we actually disable that kind of inertia, which we think is really fundamental in this case. Secondly, we talked about this second argument of Israel as our allies. What did Mark say? He said essentially like they do want to drive, like they might say that they want to drive just in the sea, but that we can moderate them. We don't think that we can moderate them. They really haven't given us a reason. We think that ultimately right now what we have to understand is that Ahmadinejad gives that rhetoric like Iran has the nuclear depth to handle a nuclear weapon, right? It has the strategic depth to handle a nuclear weapon. It can take out Israel in one hit, and we can take a couple of hits. What we have to understand is that Ahmadinejad is a real radical. That the Ayatollah, that essentially what you have to do to affect regime change, because people are kind of discontent with the Iranian regime right now, is you have to apply pressure. Yes, this might hurt people on the ground, but at the point when they get more and more hurt, they're losing out more and more, they're going to question, why are we putting up with an Islamic regime? We actually want change. We think pressure from the ground actually affects regime change, because the Islamic government is then forced to moderate. We don't think cooperation with the American government will do anything rather than consolidate the Ayatollah's power, because all of a sudden he has all these new venues to get money, all these new venues to get political power. We think this only strengthens him, doesn't weaken him. So what did they talk about? They talked about this idea of like, we talked about this idea of like it being ineffective. They're close to Russia, they're close to China. Look, diplomacy is really freaking hard, right? Where China and Russia are not going to be on side right away. We think that if we stick to our guns, ladies and gentlemen, that we can actually affect change, and we can try to incentivize Russia and China to collaborate with us. We think right now, if we're not taking a hard enough stance, there's absolutely no incentive for Russia and China to alienate one of their, essentially, like little colonies, little spheres of influence. But if America's taking a hard stance and saying that we actually have to stop nuclear proliferation, which we do, and we don't think their model of saying, as soon as you get to the development stage, we have to collaborate with you, is actually very helpful for nuclear non-proliferation. We think it essentially destroys it, because you essentially have to apply that kind of strategy to every single other country. And there are other countries, like Syria, trying to develop nuclear weapons. We don't think even if they get to development, even if they get to actual production, that we can take this kind of weak stance on them. Secondly, they talk about moderacy. What we have to understand is that the necessity of the regime, essentially what you have to look at in the Middle East, we see that it's very prudent politically to paint the US as being a big bad guy, right? But we think that like at the point in which people are actually protesting, that we cannot ease off on the regime, we have to apply more pressure. So ultimately we don't think that they actually dealt with this idea that the regime can, we don't think they dealt with this idea that this will create more moderacy. We don't think we have any reason to believe that the regime will become more moderate. Even if it does, it sets an example that all other countries can develop nuclear weapons and attain this very dangerous power, even when they're not really responsible actors and they flaunt international norms all the time. So what does this case really come down to? First, is a constructive relationship with Iran going to develop by getting rid of sanctions? Like, we think essentially that they will call our bluff, that they will continue to develop nuclear weapons, and hell, there's no reason why they wouldn't sell that technology to anyone else. Because we see that Iran has absolutely no respect for international norms. That's why we classify them as a rogue nation. They are a nation which cannot be cooperative. A rogue is in its essence, in definition, someone who acts alone, right? The international community and the international norms which benefit us all require that all of us buy into it and become stakeholders. But Iran has flaunted that, and if we allow them to get away with it, then it has absolutely no reason for anyone to kind of buy out or opt out of this process of these international norms. So we think essentially this is a race, of diplomacy versus nuclear weapons, right? Get to the stage of development, then you win, right? You are going not to face any, you're not going to face any sort of punishment, you're not going to face any sort of thing, because we're going to put our hands up. But we think that we can actually still affect change. We can see countries abandoning these nuclear weapons and these programs if we continue to apply pressure. Secondly, we think there's value in buying time. So delaying this means that there's more opportunity for collaboration with really big and important powers like China and like Russia, right? There's an advantage for North Korea not developing nuclear weapons 4 years ago, because it means more talks. It means more chances to talk with China and say, let's do something about this. And we've actually seen over time some sort of progress. It's a little bit back and forth, yes, but we have to continue to try and maintain this idea of non-nuclear proliferation. Because as soon as that goes out of the water, we're going to be living in a really dangerous world where people are going to have nuclear weapons and we don't know how they're going to use them.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his speech, and I call upon the Prime Minister to deliver his 4-minute speech to conclude the round.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had a very compelling case about why Iran having nukes is a bad thing, and we would prefer a world in which we didn't have to deal with a nuclear-armed Iranian regime. What we did not hear was a coherent policy response to how we should deal with the Iranian regime as it actually exists. If we could have stopped them meaningfully 10 years ago, we should have done it, but we didn't, so we've got to deal with the reality that we're actually faced. I'm going to talk about what happens in Iran, and then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the international consequences. So I think there's a degree to which they imposed insane burdens on us and required us to prove things that we never attempted to do. So we don't have to prove that the regime will be totally destroyed. We have to prove that the regime will be more moderate and more willing to deal with it. There are plenty of people in Iran of political significance who could play this role. People like Rafsanjani, people like Khatami, people like Mousavi, all of whom are like Islamist and nasty and mean, but way less nasty and mean than Ahmadinejad. Those are exactly the sort of people we empower when Ahmadinejad, like the principal policy difference between them is Ahmadinejad is more of a dick to the West. If the West is somewhat nicer towards Iran, I think the position of people who are saying maybe we can deal with these heathens a little bit is going to be slightly stronger. And a Rafsanjani presidency isn't someone we like, it's someone we can actually deal with and have cooperation on these issues. So that's why it's good domestically. Furthermore, they don't respond to our things about why trade is good to develop the middle class. They don't respond to our analysis about why trade means there will be American businessmen in Tehran working. There will be American products on shelves in Tehran. And that's a great way for people on the ground to see that maybe the Americans aren't so bad and they'd be less willing to listen to the rhetoric of their laws. Like, the idea here isn't to solve everything, it's to make it a bit better. I think we've very much proved that it does do that. Let's talk about the international consequences. We get this idea that there's political significance, right? If you don't have sanctions on a regime, then you can't criticize them. I point you towards China. Our policy towards China is that we trade with them because we recognize that's the best way to ensure that moderation actually occurs in the regime. But we don't shut up about things like Tibet or Taiwan. We maintain an extremely strong position on them. We think we can do exactly the same thing in Iran. If their problem is symbolic and rhetorical, then don't say we love the Iranian regime. They said, you'll be saying you love them. No, we won't. We'll be saying we hate you, but we think trading is probably the best option to actually come to some sort of compromise. Furthermore, they give you this idea that you'll set the precedent that we deal with people once they get nuclear weapons. I think that precedent was set a long time ago with countries like India and Israel and Pakistan and China. So I don't think you're setting the precedent, you're doing what we've always done. And you're doing what we've always done because it was a good idea then and it remains a good idea now. Precisely because when someone has nukes, when someone has a gun and is pointing it at you, the best thing to do is not to taunt them and to be mean to them, but to try and convince them to put it down. Look, we're not saying you're going to become friends with Iran, but the incentives for Iran to be afraid, the reasons why Iran might actually use the weapon are far reduced when they see that they can have a constructive relationship with the West, when they see that they need not be so terrified of American intervention. We tell you this will break dependence on China and Russia, say, but they'll hate America anyway. Fine, like that's totally true. The point is, it's just, if we have these sanctions, they have to deal with China in that we have these sanctions, because they need access to guns, and the Chinese are the only ones who will sell them to them. When that's not the case, when they can buy their guns from Brazil or America or Europe too, at least then when the Chinese say, we want you to do X, it'll be Iranian national interest rather than Chinese national interest that decides that question. We think that's better because our principal competitor in the world, having a nuclear armed proxy in the most strategically significant area in the globe, is probably not in our long-term interest. We also tell you about the Red Fund. I don't think we hear any meaningful response to this, about the fact that if there's going to be a nuclear power, the ability to cooperate on these things is extremely important, which is why we need to talk. Finally, they give you this idea that it's really important to protect Israel, so even buying 6 months is worth it. That sounds like a great campaign slogan, but makes absolutely no sense. Because what are you going to do with the 6 months? You can't build immunity to nukes in the 6 months. All you essentially do is become friends. So let's be mean to them to give us 6 months to become friends. That makes no sense at all. Why not just do the thing that will make them become more friendly now? We stand in opposition.